The movie opens with a young woman extremely sad and alone, who in her despair decides to throw herself from the balcony of her apartment. But wait, the scene rewinds a month, showing us the same girl named Helen. Previously, Helen was a highly famous violinist. However, one night, while in the parking lot, a man wearing a gas mask brutally attacks her and sprays chemicals in her eyes. Helen is rushed to the hospital, and when she wakes up, her eyes are bandaged. Soon, a nurse named Omar arrives to remove the bandages. Upon doing so, Helen realizes she cannot see anything. A doctor, named Katsuro, enters and explains that the chemicals left her optic nerve intact but burned it. Thus, the damage is irreversible, and she is now completely blind. Devastated, Helen can barely accept her new reality. Then, a detective named Bryce arrives to interrogate her about the incident. Helen tells Bryce what little she remembers. Afterwards, Helen talks to her brother, who is in Tokyo. He tells her that he has arranged a secret apartment near the city center for her to live in and has secured a specialized caretaker to help her adapt to her new life. The next day, Helen wakes up in her new apartment and meets her caretaker, Clayton. She doesn't remember how she got home from the hospital, which Clayton explains is due to the effects of the medication. She finds herself in an unfamiliar place when Clayton reveals that he is a professional caretaker and will be assisting her in her daily life, lending a hand with her new life as a blind person. Every day, at exactly 11 in the morning, he will be there and will leave at 2 in the afternoon. Clayton tells her that she is in her new apartment on the 9th floor of the building and describes the layout of the place. After Clayton leaves, Helen tries to call her friend Sasha and her brother, but no one answers. She feels very lonely. The next day, Clayton brings her a baby blue parakeet in a cage. Helen realizes that next to one of her windows, she can hear the noise of the street, but next to another, she hears nothing because the glass is thicker. Both start to share details of their lives and become closer. Helen asks permission to touch Clayton's face, and he agrees. That night, Helen hears a woman crying and being abused. Initially, she thinks it's in her apartment, but then realizes the sound is coming from the ventilation duct. The next day, she decides to invite her neighbor over for tea and leaves a note on the door next door. That evening, a woman named Lana knocks on Helen's door and enters to have tea. Lana acts strangely, and although she knows Helen used to be a violinist and lost her sight, she seems to know a lot about her, even though they barely knew each other. Helen touches Lana's face and, to her surprise, feels a recent scar. Lana quickly reacts, warning her not to trust anyone, and rushes out of the apartment. Convinced that Lana's husband is mistreating her, Helen contacts Detective Bryce to report the abuse her neighbor is suffering. Detective Bryce wastes no time and sends Officer Naaman to speak with Lana and make sure everything is fine. Later, Naaman confirms that she is okay and that the scar is just a birthmark. What a relief, right? But the next morning, Helen notices something odd at the place. She explains to Clayton that a car alarm goes off every 2 days at exactly 11 a.m., right when Clayton arrives at her house. It's the same car, the same alarm, at the same time. Clayton laughs and tells Helen that in a big city, there are many alarms and that she shouldn't worry. That same night, Helen is convinced that Lana returns to the apartment. However, when she touches her shoulder, it turns out to be Lana's abusive husband. He threatens her, telling her to leave his wife alone and stop being paranoid. Feeling the danger in the air, Helen immediately calls Clayton to come to her house. Clayton arrives to the rescue and comforts her. At that moment, Clayton confesses that he has feelings for her, but Helen, needing more of a caretaker than a boyfriend at that time, rejects his interest. Heartbroken, Clayton leaves the apartment. Not long after Clayton leaves, Helen is attacked again, this time by someone wearing a gas mask. With her heart in her throat, Helen manages to dial 911 before fainting, as the attacker injects something into her neck with a syringe. Later, the paramedic informs her that there is no apparent injury or needle mark on her neck. When Detective Bryce comes in, he tells her that the security cameras show no one entering the apartment after Clayton. Hearing this, Helen feels distressed, starts to doubt her own perceptions, feeling isolated from everyone and believing that someone is stalking her. Helen decides to end her life. And here is where we return to the beginning of the film, watching her as she writes a suicide note, climbs onto the balcony railing, and jumps. But instead of dying, Helen falls 6 feet and is completely unharmed. She discovers she's in a soundproof room with no door, equipped with speakers playing the sounds of a fictitious city. Realizing the high-rise building was fake, Helen understands that the apartment she was in and all the exterior noises came from a speaker system. Helen hears the 11 a.m. car alarm and returns to the apartment. She explores the hallway only to find she cannot escape. Desperate, she bangs on Lana's door. Lana tells her this is their home and there is no way out. Then, Clayton arrives to prepare dinner for Helen. As they sit down to eat, Helen hears Clayton tap the table twice. Bingo. She recognizes this double tap and realizes that everyone she has interacted with since the attack, the nurse, the doctor, the police detective, the paramedic, and Lana's husband, were, in fact, all Clayton. Realizing this truth, she pretends to drop her drink and swiftly hits him on the head with a block of knives. She grabs his keys and a stun gun and dashes into the hallway towards the adjacent apartment, only to find an empty warehouse. This is where Clayton keeps all his disguises and other trinkets for his deceit. It turns out Clayton had been disguising himself to impersonate everyone. And, even more shockingly, Helen finds the outfit of her attacker, revealing that Clayton was the one who attacked her, blinded her, and brought her to this fake apartment to keep her under control. Among the shadows, she discovers Lana, who is indeed real, in a hidden room. This room is the fake hospital room they took her to at the start of this whole ordeal. Lana spills the beans and tells Helen that she is Clayton's sister and helped him kidnap her. She says the only way out is through a ventilation duct in Clayton's room. Helen tries to escape, but Clayton catches up to her, knocks her unconscious, and drags her to his room, the same one Lana mentioned earlier, with the only exit being through a duct in the wall. Helen feels the fresh air from the duct and realizes she has another chance to escape. Meanwhile, Clayton begins his monologue, explaining his twisted reasons. As a child, his father locked him and his sister Lana in the basement, keeping them captive for 3 years after their mother's death. To survive, he invented characters in his head, gave them stories, and impersonated them. But what really saved him was the music Lana played for them in the attic. The music he heard was from Helen, a violin prodigy, who he called his light in the darkness. Now, he wanted to do the same for her. While he shared his story and motives, Helen took advantage of a momentary lapse and hit him with the stun gun, knocking him out. She opened the ventilation duct, but realized it was too small for her to pass through. Inside the duct, Helen found a small vial containing the same substance that had blinded her before. When Clayton regained consciousness, she sprayed the substance in his eyes, blinding him as well. Clayton writhed in pain, and just then, Lena arrived at the scene. Seeing Clayton incapacitated, Lena freed Helen and sent her out into the outside world. 6 months later, Helen prepares to step onto the stage before an enthusiastic crowd. We realize that Helen is present in every scene from the beginning to the end. The entire movie is told from Helen's perspective. Everything we see in this film is what Helen perceives. At this point, we delve into Helen's mind. The only thing we can trust is what she hears and touches. Do you remember the bird at the beginning of the movie, the one that changes from green to blue when Clayton tells her it's blue? Well, yes. If Helen believes the bird is blue, we see it as blue. So when someone appears in front of her, we always see the person she assumes they are. But once that person speaks, or Helen touches them, we discover who they really are, because Helen is discovering it too. This perspective is used throughout the entire movie. Helen has been trying to contact her best friend, but to no avail. Not a single response, all because Clayton has cut her off from the outside world. Helen's friends and family had no idea she was missing. Nobody knew where she was or what was happening. Towards the end of the movie, Clayton tells Helen that he wants to be her light in the darkness. Here we realize that he blinded her so that she would be so helpless she needed him. His character is similar to someone with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where a caregiver invents or causes an illness or injury in someone under their care. Clayton also explains to Helen that while she was in the attic, she created various personalities to have her own imaginary friends. He uses this talent for playing multiple characters to deceive Helen and make her believe that she is interacting with different people, even mimicking the voice of Helen's brother. At the end of the movie, the scene shifts to 6 months later with Helen playing the violin on stage again, but it's unclear if she has regained her sight. It might be that Clayton wasn't lying when he said he was the doctor who told her it was irreversible. However, he also lied about the color of the bird in his apartment. So it's very possible that we cannot trust him on this, and that Helen was only temporarily blind.